London in the year 1666 was a magnificent, yet deeply vulnerable metropolis, still recovering from the devastating plague of the previous year. It was a sprawling, medieval city of approximately 500,000 inhabitants, largely confined within the ancient Roman walls. The architecture was a testament to historical growth rather than modern planning. A vast majority of the buildings were constructed using a highly combustible mix of timber and pitch, often overhanging the narrow, winding streets in such a manner that houses practically kissed across the lanes, making them little more than wooden canyons. The streets themselves were choked with workshops, timber yards, and warehouses filled with flammable goods. Crucially, the city's primary defenses against fire hooks, ladders, and primitive hand squirts, were disorganized and woefully inadequate. A long, dry summer had left the timber structures parched, ready to ignite, and an easterly wind was poised to turn any small spark into an unstoppable inferno. The city was a colossal tinderbox, and on the fateful night of Sunday, September 2nd, the stage was set for one of the most destructive peacetime disasters in recorded history. The fire began in the early hours of Sunday morning, just after midnight, in the bakery of Thomas Fariner, or Farinor, on Pudding Lane. This location was particularly perilous, being situated near the Thames and amidst a dense cluster of highly flammable shops and storage facilities. Fariner, the king's baker, later claimed he had ensured his ovens were thoroughly extinguished, but a small ember, perhaps from a forgotten pile of faggots or fuel, found life and began to glow. When the baker and his family were awakened by the suffocating smoke and the crackle of fire, it was already too late to contain the blaze within the house. They managed to escape the burning building by climbing out an upstairs window and scrambling to an adjacent roof, though their maidservant, refusing to cross the terrifying gap, became the fire's first recorded victim. The immediate reaction was one of characteristic paralysis and error. The neighbors, alerted by the noise and heat, attempted to douse the flames with water, but the fire was too advanced. According to the city's standing laws, the only effective initial action would have been to immediately demolish the surrounding houses to create a firebreak, starving the blaze of fuel. However, the authority to order such a drastic measure lay solely with the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bludworth. When the mayor was finally summoned from his sleep and taken to Pudding Lane, he dismissively declared that the fire was so minor, a woman might piss it out, and refused the necessary demolition order, fearing the legal repercussions and costs of wrongly destroying property. This catastrophic failure of immediate leadership, coupled with the raging easterly wind that began to gust ferociously from the river, sealed the fate of the City of London. The blaze, fed by the close-packed wooden structures, rapidly spread from house to house, leaping across the narrow lanes with alarming speed, transforming a local bakery mishap into a terrifying urban conflagration. As dawn broke on Sunday, the fire was no longer a local concern. It was a crisis. The flames had already consumed Pudding Lane and were racing down Fish Street Hill toward the river. Crucially, the fire reached the immense stores of highly flammable materials kept along the riverside wharves, including coal, oil, brandy, and hemp. These stores acted as a massive accelerant, creating an intense heat that generated its own gale-force winds, pulling the fire in new directions and throwing burning embers great distances. The wind, now a formidable ally to the flames, drove the fire westward and northward. On Sunday, the fire devoured London Bridge, cutting off the southern borough of Southwark, though fortunately, a pre-existing gap in the bridge's structures prevented the fire from crossing the Thames entirely. The flames then swept into the heart of the city, destroying the ancient church of St. Magnus the Martyr and consuming the great halls of the ancient trading guilds. The Lord Mayor, Bludworth, remained ineffectual, completely overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, abandoning his post and leaving the citizenry to fend for themselves. Monday saw the fire escalate from a disaster to an apocalypse. The intense heat created a firestorm, a self-sustaining system of wind and flame that made any organized resistance almost impossible. The flames swept across the city's most densely populated and wealthiest districts. Panic began to set in among the populace. The rich desperately hired carts to remove their possessions, often paying exorbitant sums, only to have those possessions and the carts themselves consumed by the rapidly moving fire. The Guildhall, the medieval seat of London's government and justice, was consumed. Even more tragically, the flames swept through the neighborhood of the Royal Exchange, the financial heart of the city. Though built of stone, the exchange was gutted, and the priceless books and libraries of the stationers along Paternoster Row were utterly destroyed, an immeasurable cultural loss. Recognizing the utter failure of the city authorities, the responsibility for fighting the fire shifted from the mayor to the monarchy. King Charles II and his younger brother, James, Duke of York, began to take decisive action, realizing that the survival of the capital depended on royal intervention. Tuesday, September 4th, marked the catastrophic peak of the Great Fire. The raging firestorm pushed westward with such force that it seemed nothing could stop it. The flames moved into the western half of the city, threatening the legal district around the Temple and the luxurious suburb of Whitehall, where the king's own palace stood. The most shocking and symbolic loss of the day was the destruction of St. Paul's Cathedral. The cathedral was massive, built primarily of stone, and surrounded by a wide paved area. Many citizens and merchants had packed their most valuable possessions, including vast quantities of books and merchandise, into the churchyard, believing the great stone building and its surroundings to be an impregnable sanctuary. However, the intensity of the surrounding heat was so immense that it heated the stone until it cracked, while molten lead from the roof ran like a river through the streets. The scaffolding surrounding Sir Christopher Wren's ongoing repairs acted like kindling, and the great roof beams quickly caught fire. The sight of the city's iconic spire collapsing was a turning point for both the king and the people, confirming that no structure was safe. It was on this day that the king and the Duke of York truly took control. James, Duke of York, set up command posts, deploying both the king's guards and ordinary citizens into organized firefighting teams. These teams finally began to execute the strategy that should have been employed from the start: demolition. Using gunpowder, they began to systematically blow up houses in the fire's path, creating wide, open spaces devoid of fuel. The king himself rode through the streets, offering encouragement and money to the exhausted laborers, cementing his personal role in the crisis management. This centralized, decisive, and forceful action was the first effective resistance the fire had met. The efforts of the demolition squads and, perhaps more significantly, a dramatic shift in the weather, brought the inferno under control on Wednesday, September 5th. The ferocious easterly wind that had driven the fire for 3 days finally dropped to a gentle breeze, significantly slowing the rate of spread. This allowed the newly created fire breaks, particularly those near the Temple to the west and Smithfield to the north, to hold. By the evening, the flames had largely ceased their rapid advancement, though isolated fires and smoldering ruins continued to burn for weeks. The Great Fire of London was finally contained. The physical scale of the devastation was almost unimaginable. Over 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, the Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, St. Paul's Cathedral, and numerous other public buildings lay in smoking ruin. Roughly 4/5 of the city of London within the walls had been incinerated. Surprisingly, the official death toll was remarkably low, perhaps fewer than 10. This low number is attributed to the fire's relatively slow rate of spread compared to modern standards, allowing most people time to flee. However, historians now believe the true death toll was likely much higher, as many of the poor and those trapped in the rubble would have been incinerated beyond recognition. The immediate aftermath was dominated by a colossal refugee crisis. Tens of thousands of Londoners, now homeless and destitute, poured out of the city and gathered in temporary camps in the open fields to the north and east, such as Moorfields. Fear and paranoia instantly replaced panic. With the city in ruins, suspicion quickly fell upon Catholic plotters or foreign enemies, the French and the Dutch, with whom England was at war. This climate of xenophobia led to widespread harassment of foreigners. A simple-minded French watchmaker named Robert Hubert, who falsely confessed to starting the fire in Westminster using a fireball, was swiftly tried and executed at Tyburn, satisfying the public's need for a scapegoat, even though his confession was riddled with factual impossibilities. King Charles II was immediately resolute that the City of London must be rebuilt, and rebuilt quickly. The reconstruction effort became one of the greatest urban planning projects in English history. Numerous architects, most notably Sir Christopher Wren, presented grand, ambitious plans for a completely modern city of wide boulevards, rigid grids, and large piazzas. However, these visions required the immediate abolition of all previous property lines, a politically and practically impossible task given the deep-rooted legal claims of thousands of landowners. Ultimately, pragmatism won out over perfection. The city was rebuilt largely on its medieval street plan, which eased the legal process of land claim and accelerated construction. The most significant and lasting change was the passing of the Rebuilding Act, which mandated that all new houses must be constructed of brick or stone, not wood, thus eliminating the fire hazard that had plagued the old city. Building codes were established regarding the thickness of walls, the height of buildings, and the separation of workshops. The greatest architectural monuments to emerge from the ashes were the new churches. Sir Christopher Wren was appointed surveyor of the King's works and tasked with rebuilding the destroyed parish churches, culminating in the majestic new St. Paul's Cathedral. Wren's churches, 51 in total, dotted the new skyline, each a masterpiece of Baroque design, establishing the architectural identity of London for centuries to come. The monument, a great stone column near Pudding Lane, was also erected by Wren to commemorate the event, though its original inscription falsely attributing the fire to Catholic treachery was eventually removed. The legacy of the Great Fire is profound and transformative. It achieved what plague and Parliament could not: a comprehensive cleaning and modernization of the capital. The destruction of the old, crowded, unsanitary medieval city cleared the way for a more sanitary, brick-built metropolis. The Great Fire of 1666 was not just an end. It was a fiery, devastating, yet ultimately necessary beginning, laying the foundations for the powerful, well-planned, and enduring capital city we know today.